Why is the politics of America being more reluctant than, say, other members of the Europeans to support Ukraine through the military usage of certain weapons?
Well, I think the reluctance is twofold. One is about nuclear escalation, and the second is about Russian territory and destabilization of the Putin regime. I don't think Washington is behind Ukrainian victory. I think it's behind Ukrainian survival. And a strong filter on the West's approach is the minimization of the risk of nuclear escalation. And there is some debate as to whether this will change with the Harris administration.
Incursion into Russian territory would be a red line that Moscow would not be willing to suddenly dismiss.
Without having replaced it with a second conception of victory that is clear and has clear civic backing.
This is The Global Gambit.
So, day 921 of the war in Ukraine. Some of the events, main things, have been Russia striking Kiev with dozens of drones and missiles in the early hours of the morning, including a school. Other parts of the country have come under multiple aerial attacks from Russians. Whilst on the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians have criticized the Mongolian leadership and government for not holding up their international obligations of arresting Putin under the warrants of the International Criminal Court or ICC, although one would be surprised if they did, mainly because international law and rules and norms seem to be being eroded or severely undermined the longer that this war goes on. This is The Global Gambit, and my name is Piotr, a podcast that looks at the international system, geopolitics, and the relationship to economics and just where the West sits in this ever-changing world. And this time we're talking with a fellow YouTuber, a fellow person who has, well, if you're coming from his channel or you know his face, then he needs no introduction. But for those of you who don't know who Vlad Vlexa is, he is an academic and someone who likes to talk about politics, philosophy, and obviously, of course, the relationship of Ukraine to Russia in the broader context of the globe. Vlad, it's a delight to have you on. How are you?
I'm very happy to be speaking with you and with everybody.
Wonderful. So we're going to split this conversation into two parts. The first part will be about Vlad's perspectives of Kursk and Russia's incremental gains in the eastern part of Ukraine. And then the second half will be about Vlad's perspective of Russia, Putin, and the future of the country, because whether or not you think Russia might be doing better in the war than Ukraine at the moment, they're certainly not having an easy time. And the future of Russia always looks a little bit opaque. So, Vlad, I think the first question I really want to put to you is, what is your perspective of Ukraine's offensive? How well do you think it is going? Many people argue that it's not as good as some people would like to argue. We've had Ben Hodges on, we've had Lawrence Friedman on. Different perspectives offer different, ideas of the success of this. What's yours?
I distinguish between activist perspectives that are about trying to put enough stuff out there that might tilt things in Ukraine's favor, and analysis. I think there's a lot of swapping of hats of that kind going on, and sometimes hard for people to work out what's what. And both are completely legitimate, by the way, and both analysis and activism have a place. Military experts, as of today, are undecided about the significance of the Kursk incursion, and they're approaching it with a wait-and-see attitude and a degree of both caution and optimism, and I don't comment on military matters. So what I can say is how it is looking politically so far, even though that can get very quickly overruled by new developments or by the military picture becoming much clearer. Politically, I think there are several things going on there. One is that it has obviously had a certain kind of emotional mobilizing effect in Ukraine, as it was intended to. It has had a certain, albeit questionable, mobilizing effect in the West, really at the level of inserting a crack into the idea that it's simply true that the longer the war goes on, the more of an advantage Russia will edge out. So it's kind of put a crack in that perspective that was developing. And at the level of rules of engagement, there's a possibility that it might tip the West into further disinhibitions over use of Western weapons on Russian territory. What's less likely is something further, such as an interception of Russian missiles by a coalition of the willing on Ukrainian territory. At the level of which I'm perhaps more qualified to speak, at the level of how far the incursion may have destabilized Russia, I'd say two things. In the long term, but I really mean the long term, so that's not today or next year or the year after next, really a decade ahead, it is hard to overestimate how toxic it is for a country not to control its own territory and seem relatively unworried about that. There's a kind of a toxic mine underneath any kind of project, benign or malign, on the Russian space that's about keeping Russia's territorial integrity, right, in the decades to come, and about retaining a monopoly over organized violence. There's many things that Putin has done over the last few years that have undermined both of these. However, I don't think there's any justification for being alarmist or expecting transformation on Russian territory now as a result of the Kursk incursion. It has not done much to politicize the Russian population. In fact, people in the Kursk region themselves think that the war may have begun on August 6, 2024. So it's an illusion and a misunderstanding of how that deep depoliticization of the Russian population works, to think that by bringing the war to Russian citizens, you'll necessarily awaken them politically. Partly that's because the very reason they're depoliticized is that facing up to politics would mean admitting that they have slid into a situation in which their relationship with politics has come to be disastrous. And that's pain. And actually, the worse things get in some ways, the harder it is to face this. So it's important to be properly cautious about that. And indeed, there's absolutely no evidence of any cracks in the regime as a result of this. In fact, Russia's borderless self-image, if you like, rather helps it absorb this news story. So about the impact in Russia, I'm an alarmist long-term, but a real skeptic in the short term.
Yes, well, we're teasing the part 2 bit quite well then, but I do want to focus on the Ukrainians' perspective into Kursk, because I think that it's good to decompartmentalize one side and the other, of course, keeping the natural understanding that they are integrated. And to your point, it's sort of seemingly borderless at this point, although historically these two have always been very heavily interlinked. And whether or not you can apply more modern state borders and boundaries to this historical complex region is one thing. But very simply put then, do you think that the incursion, the offensive, as General Hodges likes to call it, and there'll be a link to the interview with him in the description for people who are interested, do you think it's a good idea? Do you think that Ukraine is not potentially spreading themselves too thinly? Of course, I don't think their intention is to try to take over Russia, but do you think that this might be a little bit of a strategic risk on the part of Kiev?
So that's a military question, I think, to a large extent, and that means that I have to, as it were, partly step aside. Now, it's more than possible that it turns out to be a success militarily, which roughly means perhaps Ukraine holding what they have for a long time without any significant blowback in Donetsk. It could prove to be a military failure if things don't go well in Donetsk in a way that's clearly linked to Kursk and they fail to hold Kursk as well. But that's something I'm going to leave to military experts to help us follow and analyze. What I will say is that your question is very good, but there is also a second question, and that is, was this perhaps necessary for Ukraine? In other words, is this something that they needed to do because they felt that an uncertain shake-up of the state of the war was something that was needed, in part because of a risk of a drift in the West toward a kind of consensus that you got to try to stop this sooner or later, one way or another. And in Ukraine, they feel that Trump's more likely to go in that direction, but they're also aware of the pressures on the Harris administration to take seriously the idea that the war needs to stop. Now, the trouble is that nobody has a way of stopping it that's sustainable at the moment, because for Putin, stopping the war will likely be just a method of winning it later. And for Ukraine, stopping the war is really untenable if it's not compatible with Ukraine's economic and political sustenance, and if it's not compatible with civic support at home for that outcome. So one sort of sisterly question that sits alongside your question is, might it not be the case that this was a shakeup that the Ukrainians felt was necessary at this point? Now, back to your question of whether it's going to work out in their favor, I think that politically so far, it's advantaged Ukraine as far as Kursk goes. There's absolutely no doubt about that, because we have potentially extra movement on rules of engagement with Western weapons coming on Russian territory. And we have a certain shakeup of the narrative that this is just an inexorably building advantage for the Russians. But this short-term political advantage could be reversed if this whole enterprise turns out to backfire militarily. And I can't untie these two at the moment. But as we stand today, if there is a prospect of this not backfiring in Donetsk militarily and Ukraine holding the territory for a long time, then it could be that some of the political advantages that have accrued in the short term, that they hold.
Okay. But at the same time, we have this, shall we say, ambiguity from certain members of NATO from the West about the application and willingness of them to utilize, or for the Ukrainians to utilize, larger scale, longer range weapons further into Russia. Obviously, the main best example has been Britain, the UK, and the US. Not necessarily at loggerheads, but there's a bit of a difference of opinion here, perspective, about the UK wants to allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles, and the American government is more apprehensive, showing more restraint, or wanting to show more restraint. Where do you sit yourself? I understand it might be a bit of a military question, but mainly on the political front, where do you think why is the politics of America being more reluctant than, say, other members of the Europeans to support Ukraine through the military usage of certain weapons?
Well, I think the reluctance is twofold. One is about escalation, in particular nuclear escalation. And the second is about destabilization of Russian territory and destabilization of the Putin regime. Insofar as we in the West have a strategy toward this conflict, it's not a Ukraine victory strategy, it's a Ukraine survival strategy. I don't think Washington is behind a Ukrainian victory. I think it's behind Ukrainian survival. And a strong filter on the West's approach is the minimization of the risk of nuclear escalation. And there is some debate as to whether this will change with the Harris administration. But if it changes, it'll be really moving this business of nuclear escalation as a concern from being concern number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and number 5 to being just number 1 and number 2. So that's going to be the shift. It's still going to be absolutely central, as it always will be in the West's relationship with Russia and China. So that's one absolutely central issue, right? That Washington believes that whatever the risk of nuclear war is, if it's 1%, we shouldn't make it 1.5%. Whereas, of course, if you're fighting for your national survival and somebody says, well, you survive if we elevate nuclear risk to 4%, you'd take that 4%, even if that endangered the world. The second reason is that there's deep concern in some, but not in all Western centers of power. This concern rather diminishes if you travel eastward in Europe about destabilization of Russian territory. The West has a very complex history of counterproductive regime change. This always raises the question, what happens if you get rid of a regime to the state behind the regime? Will the state collapse if the regime collapses? One of the illusions about Iraq 20 years ago was that you could collapse the regime without collapsing the state. There's a real worry in the West, quite frankly, about Putin losing power, Putin's regime imploding, and the destabilizing consequences of that too. So these are two breaks that are put in place when it comes to the rules of engagement Ukraine has for Western weapons. My own view is that further disinhibition of use is very strongly supported. I'd roughly favor it, but it'd be a military question what form it would take. But essentially, it'd be a conversation about these two elements, right? Stability on Russian territory and escalation. Escalation is a conversation about red lines. And I think here we can say two things that are obvious, but then very much, things get very much less obvious in the middle. On the one hand, it's obvious that the West has been rather conservative about worrying about Russia's red lines. The Biden administration has been very cautious about this in a way that has, in my opinion, undermined Western policy. On the other hand, it is obviously irrational to claim that Russia has no red lines at all. The question is, what are they? And this is difficult because it's possible that we don't know them and we can't know them. It's possible that the Russians don't know them. It's possible that they change. So it's always important to retain a modicum of epistemic humility here. But in the context of worrying about nuclear escalation, my own feeling is that you have to consider not just the risk of allowing Ukraine to do this, but the risk of not allowing Ukraine to do this, because it also has consequences. And this also has nuclearly dangerous consequences. In other words, we risk nuclear war to some extent if we back Ukraine strongly. If we allow Putin to succeed in Ukraine, we also risk nuclear war because Putin is on a kind of escalatory mission. So there aren't easy answers here, but on balance, my proposal at this point is that the case for further disinhibiting Ukraine in this regard is extremely strong.
So we can imagine, therefore, a scenario whereby Putin feels that the constant or gradual incursions into Kursk get too much, that maybe it is potential use of a tactical nuclear weapon. I think the main scenario people have argued is, well, why would Putin utilize a nuclear weapon or something like that on Russian territory? But they seem to forget that it doesn't just have to be directed at the forces that are encroaching on Russian territory. It can be just within the Gulf of, not the Gulf, the Sea of Azov. It could be as a symbolic strike. It could be on a minor settlement area in northeast Ukraine. It could be somewhere that isn't really geographically related to Kursk. But that being said, a lot of analysts thought, including myself, incursion into Russian territory would be a red line that Moscow would not be willing to suddenly dismiss. But here we are. What is going on? What are red lines?
I have three thoughts. There will be a main video, a video on my main channel soon about Putin's red lines, because I think there's a lot of fog that needs to be cleared in this conversation.
Perhaps a lot of
a modicum of hot air, but there's also a lot of uncertainty. You have to give people a break. I would say this, and these are going to be ill-assorted thoughts, but let's throw them about the place. First of all, the Putin regime conceives of existential threats to Russia as really threats to itself. So the moment I start getting really concerned is when these folks feel that they are in a corner and things are getting existential for them. They don't feel that remotely about Kursk. They feel completely comfortable about Kursk at the level of threat to regime. We wouldn't be, right, if we lived in a country that was taken over by another country, but they're fine with it. So one thought that's really important in this is that Putin, in good part, conceives of himself as being the same thing as Russia, and Russia as being the same thing as himself. So the kinds of threats to Russia that he'd really worry about are threats that existentially threaten his hold over power or his life. And part of the reason he started the war is because the democratic Ukraine is perceived by him as a threat to his life. When things get unstable in Ukraine, in Russia, rather, having a democratic Ukraine on Russia's border could critically tilt the regime toward collapsing when it's vulnerable. And that could be a threat to his life, in his view. And so he worries about that. So that's one thought. I mean, is this a threat to Putin's life and Putin's regime is an important filter. A couple of worrying thoughts about nuclear escalation that I'd put on the table on top of this, even though my own feeling is that the risk of nuclear escalation today is low. In fact, very low. But the two worrying thoughts are regimes like Putin's may not operate in relation to military purposes the way we would. If a political leader in the West were told there is absolutely no military purpose in using a particular weapon, they wouldn't use it. That's not obviously true for a regime like Putin's, where you could imagine a situation that starts with the premise that a weapon will get used, and the job of the military is to find a purpose for that. Now, I think, again, I'm not particularly worried about that at the moment, but it's an important remark to make. And then there is a bigger remark to make that I think is, in my capacity as a political philosopher, I think the most important observation about the Putin regime, and that is that its rationality in relation to nuclear weapons is different to ours. And in this respect, it's very important to understand this is a very different kind of regime to the Soviet regime. In other words, Scholz and Macron are closer to Brezhnev and Khrushchev than to Putin when it comes to nuclear escalation. These folks thought more like us about it. There is genuinely a self-destructive and apocalyptic element to the Putin regime that, in a way that shouldn't keep us awake at night, nevertheless somewhat tilts that regime's calculus on what it would mean to have a global nuclear exchange. There's a somewhat radical element to that regime that is reminiscent of what we encounter with radical terror organizations, reminiscent of what we sometimes encounter with certain kinds of fundamentalist terror. That doesn't tilt the pendulum dramatically, in my view, but it does make a significant difference to how I see that regime and the question of avoiding global nuclear war. Having said all of this, I think nuclear risk, in my assessment today, is very low.
I think it goes without saying that Ukraine has been stuck in a tug of war between the West and Russia for much of its independence, and albeit even when it wasn't really an independent sovereign state. And the more, should we say, incremental influences of the Europeans or just democracy had over Ukraine, the encapsulation being the Orange Revolution in 2004, has undermined or severely influenced, I think, Putin's approach to his near abroad sphere of influence foreign policy in subsequent years. And you can argue that there are different phases of Putin as he's gotten older. COVID was an influential one where he's sort of in his latest phase, but we will come to that in a bit. The point I wanted to raise with you a little bit more is that I appreciate your ability to recognize that things are not all sort of rose tinted. I feel that there are some people who are sort of so down in support of one side, which I'm not, obviously not against Ukraine, but I think that there is a degree of realism and pragmatism that needs to be had, and people who are so far in on one side can lose sight of sometimes. You manage to, I think, support but equally recognise the risks or limitations that exist on certain details of the situation. What do you think that Ukraine should be doing from a political perspective to harness its the situation better? As you said, the momentum's with Ukraine as it is, but it's not free of challenges. I'm thinking specifically the demographics perspective, and the the average age being what now plus 40 of new recruits, which is quite significant, and people are concerned about, but people don't like to talk about it because it doesn't play into the broader narrative of Ukraine on winning outright and all this sort of thing. Any perspective on that?
So I'm not a Ukraine country expert, and it's an eternity since I've been to Ukraine. So in a certain sense, it's unethical of me to go beyond just some general points that are more general than the additional detail I'd go into with Russia.
Well, if you want to bring in Russia as well, then feel free to do so.
What I think is extraordinarily difficult this moment for Ukraine, I think the Kursk incursion feeds into trying to solve this problem, is that they're in the middle of giving up a conception of victory, which is full territorial liberation, without having replaced it with a second conception of victory that is clear and has clear civic backing. That is a very, very, very difficult place in which to be, because it puts pressure on the political system. It puts pressure on domestic issues like mobilization. If there is an urgent pressure for a deepening of a very difficult civic conversation, which is what does victory look like for us, given the challenges we face, given the nature of this brutal imperial aggression coming into our country, and given the realistic capacities of the West. So that's one very, very big challenge. A civic conversation about a conception of victory that does not involve full territorial liberation. Because let's be very clear here. If Ukraine liberates all of its territory, which is possible if a collapse in Russia occurs of a certain kind, but if Ukraine liberates all of its territory, including Crimea, that will not be because it was the West's position to support Ukraine to that threshold. The West's position is not to support Ukraine to that threshold. And therefore, that cannot any longer be the default expectation short of some kind of Russian collapse. So what does victory look like? And this breaks down into several really important questions. Some of them are practical. How much territorial reacquisition is minimally required for economic and political sustainability in the medium term? That's a very important question, again, for experts and country experts to analyze. So that will feed, among much else, into a conversation about what constitutes a victory for Ukraine if it's not full territorial reacquisition. So that's one important issue. There's this conversation about what it means to come out well out of the war and sustainably so. A second area that is a very important question here is what arguments does Ukraine make for the sustenance of support from the West? My concern is that at the level of discourse, there's room for improvement here. That's to say, the largely moral arguments that worked in the first year of the war ceased to work in 2023 and do not work now. That's to say, it's not that they're completely ineffective, but they don't work as the central story. That's to say, you can't just say, we are a democracy, and this is about freedom because an aggressive neighbor that has nothing to offer except violence has come into our territory and is doing terrible things here, is here completely unjustly, needs to be kicked out, and we're in Europe as well. That unfortunately, is no longer as motivating as it was, even though a humanitarian disposition remains quite widely, if not very deeply present in Western citizens. So I think that the argument much more clearly needs to be about how this is about the West's critical national security interest to support Ukraine. I want much more practical, political argument being made that appeals to issues of the national interest of the United States and the European security architecture. Then a third area would be kind of a wide theme, if you like, of Ukraine's geopolitical indispensability outside of the West. That's to say, how does Ukraine maximize itself as a global player that is an important part of issues that occur outside of the West? And this also is something that needs a degree of additional thought and can sometimes be undermined by a dismissive attitude toward countries that don't support Ukraine fully. Then one last issue I'd mention is an issue that is quite frankly gone, and it's not realistic, and that is to very clearly propose a picture of what the ex-Soviet space should look like 10 years from now, that in part conceives Ukraine's war as a war of liberation against the Russians, but in part conceives of Ukraine's war as the starkest expression of the conflict between democracy and authoritarian imperialism on the ex-Soviet space. That means thinking in broader terms about what's going on. That means, for instance, taking more seriously than is being taken now Ukraine's allyship with the Belarusian opposition. The trouble here is that while there hasn't been that much strategic articulation about this coming out of Ukraine, there's also been virtually none coming out of the Russian opposition and virtually none coming from the West. So this is a complete strategic empty space, if you like. Nobody's thinking about this properly. So I don't think this can constitute, if you like, a criticism of Ukraine. But nevertheless, it's an important issue to put on the table, because appealing to questions of what it means to sustainably visualize the ex-Soviet space is again something that could get Ukraine more support from the West.
Well, you said a few general answers, but frankly, I think that was quite the skill of articulation and eloquence in them. And everyone, if you're enjoying this part 1, then be sure to subscribe so you don't miss part 2 when it comes out.